The rain in Neo-Elysium did not fall from clouds, but dripped from the atmospheric filtration vents in a sterile, chemical drizzle. It washed over a city that had conquered death, only to lose its soul. Above the suffocating smog layer, the upper spires of the city pierced the artificial dome like diamond needles. Here, the sanguine aristocracy reigned supreme. They were posthumans, creatures of flawless synthetic skin, woven carbon fiber muscles, and hyper-advanced neuro-linked minds. Their immortality, however, was purchased at a steep, unyielding price. It required continuous infusions of synth-oxy, a luminescent, hyper-oxygenated artificial blood that coursed through visible subdermal conduits along their necks, arms, and spines. They had completely transcended human frailty, but in doing so, they had become beautiful, stagnant parasites reliant on a sprawling industrial machine. Princess Seraphina stood rigid on the observation deck of a heavily armored repulsor skiff, her crimson cape snapping violently in the harsh, artificial wind. Her own subdermal lines glowed a soft, royal violet, a visual testament to her pure, heavily augmented lineage. She was the direct heir to the High Council, bred, engineered, and conditioned to rule. Yet, as she stared down into the abyssal depths of the subterranean sectors, a cold knot of dread tightened in her remaining organic heart. Below the pristine sun-simulated spires lay the rust vats, a sprawling, lightless subterranean slum housing the naturals. These were the unaugmented, the baseline humans who bred, bled, and died in the damp dark. They served merely as biological raw material and menial labor for the gleaming city above. The council viewed them as a necessary vermin, a resource to be managed and culled. Seraphina viewed them with a confusing, gnawing guilt that no algorithmic inhibitor could entirely suppress. The repulsor skiff banked sharply, its engines humming a low, aggressive frequency as it descended into the cavernous depths of Sector 4. Today was a tithe raid. The naturals were failing to meet their harsh quotas in the geothermal refineries, and the Chancellor demanded a severe demonstration of consequence. Seraphina was here to oversee the operation, mandated by her uncle as an exercise in necessary ruthlessness for the future queen. Searchlights from the escort drones sliced through the perpetual gloom, illuminating rusted scaffolding and leaning shanties cobbled together from scavenged plasteel and corrugated tin. The sanguine enforcers dropped from the skiffs like armored predatory birds. They hit the rusted decking with heavy metallic impacts, their thermal rifles raised and tracking. Panic erupted instantly across the sector. Naturals, clad in greasy rags and soot, scattered like insects fleeing a sudden, blinding light. The enforcers moved with terrifying algorithmic precision. They did not shout, and they did not break into a chaotic run. They stalked. They fired non-lethal shock bolas that wrapped around legs and torsos, bringing down fleeing targets with brutal efficiency before dragging them toward the waiting, heavily fortified processing transports. Seraphina disembarked, her armored boots crunching loudly on discarded debris. The air down here was thick, choking her olfactory sensors with the smell of ozone, decaying organic matter, and the sharp, undeniable tang of genuine human fear. Her retinal displays painted the world in harsh thermal hues, highlighting the desperate, fleeing bodies of the naturals in bright, frantic orange against the cold, dead blue of the slums. She ordered her elite personal guard to hold their position near the command transport. She needed to walk this wretched ground alone, to force herself to witness the raw misery her family commanded from the safety of the clouds. She wandered down a narrow, winding alleyway, moving away from the main plaza where the bulk of the brutal arrests were taking place. The shadows here were absolute, a physical weight pressing against the rusted walls, but her augmented vision cut through the darkness effortlessly. At the far end of the alley, huddled beneath a collapsed, dripping ventilation duct, A small thermal signature flared brightly on her HUD. Serafina drew her sidearm, a sleek, humming pulse pistol, and advanced slowly. "By order of the High Council, remain exactly where you are," she commanded. Her voice was automatically amplified and synthesized by her armor, sounding like a cold, wrathful god echoing in a canyon. The figure did not flee. It did not move at all. Serafina stepped closer, the glow from her violet lifelines casting an eerie, pulsating light on the surrounding damp debris. She lowered the pistol slightly. It was a child. He could not have been more than 8 years old. He wore an oversized, heavily stained tunic that swallowed his small frame, his bare feet black with layers of grime. He was a pure natural, entirely devoid of interface ports, subdermal wires, or synthetic flesh grafting. He looked incredibly fragile against the sharp metal of his surroundings, like a delicate relic from a forgotten museum of human history. He was backed tightly into the corner, his small hands resting flat against the rusted bulkhead behind him. Serafina's combat telemetry instantly painted him with a targeting reticle and ran a rapid threat analysis. Threat level 0, no concealed weapons detected, elevated heart rate, but surprisingly stable respiratory function. He was not crying. Every natural child Serafina had ever witnessed during these brutal raids wept, screamed, or curled into a catatonic ball of primal terror. This boy just watched her. His eyes were wide and dark, taking in the towering, heavily armored figure of the post-human princess, the deadly weapon hanging loosely in her grip, and the glowing purple veins that pulsed rhythmically at her throat. "You are unregistered," Serafina said. She overrode her helmet's vocal processors, letting her natural voice slip through. It sounded surprisingly soft, entirely out of place in the industrial hellscape. "Where are your guardians?" The boy tilted his head, a gesture of pure, innocent curiosity. He looked past her weapon, past the intimidating silhouette of her armor, and stared directly into her organic eyes, the only part of her face that remained untouched by the sanguine engineers. Then, he smiled. It was not a smirk of defiance, nor a grimace of broken compliance meant to appease an oppressor. It was a genuine, radiant smile of pure, unadulterated warmth and recognition. The exact moment the muscles in his face shifted, something utterly impossible happened. Serafina's advanced retinal HUD flickered violently, immediately flooding her vision with cascading red error codes. A sudden massive surge of localized electromagnetic interference washed over her, centering entirely on the child. A faint, impossible bioluminescent aura, glowing with the warm hue of ancient, forgotten sunlight, pulsed outward from the boy's skin, illuminating the damp alleyway. It hit Serafina like a physical shockwave. Her synthetic nervous system, a marvel of billion-credit post-human engineering, completely short-circuited. The violet fluid in her subdermal tubes flashed blindingly white for a fraction of a second, and a high-pitched, deafening whine filled her audio receptors. Her arm dropped lifelessly to her side, the expensive pulse pistol slipping from her fingers and clattering loudly against the plasteel grating. Serafina collapsed heavily onto one knee, the servo motors in her armor whining in protest as her heavily modified body betrayed her. She was trembling, her woven carbon fiber muscles locked and unlocked in rapid, violent, uncontrollable spasms. A sensation she had never experienced in her entire century of engineered life surged through her chest. It was a deep, resonant vibration that felt like a primal song echoing directly through her remaining organic bone. It was terrifying in its absolute power, yet overwhelmingly beautiful. Her internal diagnostic displays screamed critical warnings of systemic failure and unauthorized external overrides, yet her countermeasures detected no hacking signal, no digital intrusion of any kind. This was not code. It was a biological frequency, an ancient planetary resonance dormant in human DNA that her sophisticated machinery could not comprehend. But her organic heart recognized instantly and bowed to. The fragile child had not attacked her. His simple, profound display of genuine joy had triggered a cataclysmic biological reaction within her hybrid form. Serafina gasped for air, clutching her armored chest plate, fighting through the digital static to reboot her basic motor functions. She stared at the child through a haze of failing optical sensors. Who was this boy? And what deep, buried mechanism of the world had his simple expression just violently unlocked? The heavy, rhythmic march of her elite guard echoed down the alleyway, forcing a choice that would shatter a century of engineered loyalty in a single heartbeat. Serafina acted on pure, organic instinct, a messy and chaotic drive her synthetic upgrades were designed to brutally suppress. She scooped the boy into her arms. He was startlingly light, a fragile bundle of hollow bones and grime, yet he radiated a comforting, anomalous warmth against her cold plasteel chest plate. With a swift motion, she swept her voluminous crimson command cape over him, securing him against her flank just as her lead enforcer rounded the corner. The enforcer's optical sensors scanned the damp brickwork. Serafina stood tall, forcing her internal cooling fans to silence and overriding the tremors still echoing through her carbon fiber muscles. She projected an aura of absolute, terrifying boredom. She reported the alley empty, a dead end with no viable targets, and ordered her squad back to the extraction skiffs. The ascent back to the upper echelons of Neo-Elysium was agonizingly tense. Serafina bypassed the standard processing protocols, utilizing her royal clearance to divert her personal skiff directly to her private spire. Her sanctuary was a sprawling, sterile expanse of white marble and transparent aluminum, suspended a mile above the suffocating smog of the slums. It was a fortress of privilege. Yet as she set the boy down on a plush, synthetic silk divan, it suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated trap. Before she could even ask the boy his name, the room's ambient lighting dimmed. A towering, three-dimensional holographic projection materialized in the center of the chamber. It was Chancellor Valerius, her uncle and the undisputed architect of the sanguine aristocracy's brutal regime. Valerius was a terrifying vision of posthuman evolution. Almost nothing of his original flesh remained. He was a lattice of polished chrome and dark carbon weaves, his synthetic blood conduits pulsing with a harsh, blindingly bright crimson light that bespoke a highly aggressive military-grade oxygenation mix. He did not smile. He simply existed as a monument to absolute authority. He informed Serafina that the tithe raid was merely a precursor. He was pushing the eradication mandate through the High Council by the end of the solar cycle. The naturals, he declared with chilling calm, were an obsolete variable in their perfect equation. He had secretly finalized the construction of a fully automated synthetic blood grid, an endless self-sustaining loop of chemical generation that required zero biological raw material. Once the grid was online, the subterranean slums would be flooded with localized incendiary gas, cleansing the city of its final messy tether to humanity's primitive past. Serafina kept her facial muscles locked in a mask of regal indifference, offering tight nods of agreement while her organic heart pounded furiously against her ribs. She was harboring a fugitive of the very species her uncle was about to systematically extinguish. If Valerius's internal algorithms detected even a micro-fluctuation in her vocal cadence, the automated defense turrets in her own ceiling would shred her into scrap metal. Valerius terminated the connection, leaving the cold promise of genocide hanging in the pristine air. She turned back to the boy. He was tracing the glowing patterns on a nearby decorative console, completely unfazed by the terrifying hologram he had just witnessed. He told her his name was Leo. Serafina guided Leo into her private medical bay, a hyper-advanced suite normally used to calibrate her cybernetic enhancements. She needed to understand what had happened in the alley. Why this child possessed the power to shatter a posthuman's neural pathways with a mere change of expression. She extracted a single drop of blood from his finger, placing it into the central molecular sequencer. The diagnostic machinery immediately flared with cascading alerts. It was not a virus, nor a bioweapon. The sequencer was attempting to read a genetic structure so complex, so densely packed with dormant information, that it was overwhelming the processor's quantum core. Serafina brought the data strings up on a massive curved display, her eyes darting across the scrolling lines of code. It was a lock and a key intertwined. Leo's DNA contained the uncorrupted master code for the Genesis Protocol, Earth's legendary long-dormant planetary terraforming network. Centuries ago, before the sanguine aristocracy sealed the sky and claimed a monopoly on survival, humanity had built an underground network of purification spires designed to heal the irradiated atmosphere and poisoned oceans. The project was abandoned, deemed a failure, and lost to the ashes of history. But the data on the screen told a different, darker story. The network was never broken. It was deliberately locked away. The sanguine founders had sabotaged the awakening sequence to maintain their absolute grip on power. Knowing that a healed Earth would render their synthetic dome and their vital, artificial blood supply completely obsolete, Leo was not just a child. He was a living, breathing, biological broadcast key. His smile, the pure emotion of it, generated a specific bioelectric frequency designed to interface with the ancient terraforming technology. When directed at Serafina, that frequency had collided violently with her corrupted synthetic physiology, triggering the catastrophic system failure. The realization struck her like a physical blow. The sanguine aristocracy was a lie built on the deliberate suffocation of a planet. If Valerius discovered the boy's true nature, he would dissect him to ensure the Genesis Protocol remained buried forever. Her private spire was no longer safe. The internal security grids routinely scanned for unauthorized biological material. It was only a matter of hours before the automated sweep flagged Leo's unregistered heartbeat. She could not fight the entire city garrison, and her royal access codes would be revoked the moment she tried to leave the upper tiers with a natural. She needed someone who operated outside the algorithms, someone who navigated the blind spots of the sanguine security apparatus. She needed a ghost. She needed Jax, accessing a heavily encrypted shadow network through a burner terminal. Serafina pulled up a dossier on the city's most elusive rogue. Jax was a smuggler, a cynical, quick-witted operator infamous for moving highly illegal contraband straight through the city's impenetrable energy shields. He held no allegiance to the aristocracy and viewed the naturals with equal measures of pity and pragmatic detachment. He was motivated solely by credits and the thrill of outsmarting a system designed by immortal gods. Serafina stripped off her royal armor, trading the gleaming plasteel and crimson fabric for an inconspicuous hooded scavenger's cloak that concealed her glowing subdermal lines. She wrapped Leo in a similar oversized garment, pulling the hood low over his bright, observant eyes. They slipped out through a forgotten maintenance access tunnel, descending rapidly through the structural pillars of the city. Serafina was leaving her entire world behind, trading an eternity of sterile luxury for a desperate gamble in the shadows. She had a planetary key walking beside her, a genocidal uncle mobilizing an army above her, and her only hope for survival rested entirely in the hands of a criminal she had never met. She checked the heavy pulse pistol hidden beneath her cloak, wondering if Jax's legendary loyalty to the highest bidder would hold when the currency was the fate of the Earth itself. The neon-drenched underbelly of Neo-Elysium smelled of burnt ozone and desperate deals. A perfect incubator for a planetary rebellion. Deep within this subterranean labyrinth, a fugitive princess was about to purchase a ghost. Serafina navigated the claustrophobic alleys of Sector 9, keeping her oversized scavenger's cloak tightly wrapped to conceal the royal violet illumination of her subdermal lifelines. Little Leo walked silently beside her, his small hand gripping the coarse fabric of her disguise. They reached a rusted blast door secured by a heavy magnetic lock. It was the entrance to a defunct geothermal monitoring station, now repurposed as a chop shop for illegal vehicle modifications. She keyed in a sequence she had memorized from the Shadow Network dossier. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a cavernous garage lit by harsh, flickering argon lamps. Sparks rained down from a gantry crane where a man was violently wrenching a plasma manifold out of a stolen patrol skiff. This was Jax. He dropped lightly to the grease-stained floor, wiping his hands on a rag that was already completely black. He wore a battered synth-leather jacket and utility pants lined with custom holsters. His face was rugged, framed by unruly dark hair, and his eyes held the sharp, predatory intelligence of a man who had survived by trusting absolutely no one. He looked at the towering, cloaked figure and the small, dirty child, entirely unimpressed by the dramatic entrance. Jax demanded to know why a prime target of the sanguine enforcers was currently tracking toxic ash into his meticulously unkempt workspace. Serafina pulled back her hood. The ambient light caught the flawless, synthetic porcelain of her skin and the glowing purple conduits tracking up her neck. Jax froze, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy blaster strapped to his thigh. A post-human royal in his garage meant an execution squad was usually 10 seconds behind. Serafina moved faster than humanly possible, tossing a heavy encrypted platinum data drive onto his workbench before he could draw his weapon. She explained it contained unrestricted access codes to the Chancellor's private offshore credit reserves. It was enough wealth to buy an entire orbital habitat. She needed passage through the outer quarantine wall and into the deep wasteland, immediately, with no questions asked. Jax looked at the drive, then at the princess, and finally at the small, unaugmented boy clutching her cloak. A cynical smirk broke across his face. He pocketed the drive, remarking that he always charged extra for transporting high treason, especially when it involved babysitting. Within minutes, they were strapped into the cabin of Jax's custom transport rig. It was a brutalist machine, a heavily armored all-terrain rover equipped with illegal military-grade repulsor lifts and a heavily modified cloaking field. Jax slammed the thrusters forward. The rover launched out of the hidden garage, tearing through the labyrinthine maintenance tunnels that fed the city's lower industrial sectors. The escape was a masterpiece of chaotic precision. Jax drove like a madman, drifting the massive rover around tight corners, narrowly avoiding automated cargo trams and industrial grinders. He bypassed 2 inner security checkpoints by broadcasting a cloned patrol signal, his hands flying across the control console with practiced ease. The final obstacle was the quarantine wall. It was a colossal barrier of magnetized plasteel, shimmering with a lethal high-voltage plasma shield designed to keep the toxic wasteland out and the enslaved naturals in. Alarms began to blare across the sector as the automated defense grid finally registered their unauthorized trajectory. Crimson warning lights strobed wildly, painting the tunnel in panicked flashes. Jax did not slow down. He armed a custom electromagnetic pulse torpedo mounted on the rover's reinforced hood. He waited until they were terrifyingly close to the shimmering plasma shield. Close enough for Serafina to feel the static charge prickling her remaining organic skin. He fired. The torpedo detonated against the barrier, creating a violent, localized tear in the energy field. Jax jammed the throttle to the maximum. The heavy rover slammed through the breach, its reinforced chassis scraping violently against the melting plasteel edges of the wall. Searing heat flooded the cabin for a terrifying second before they broke through to the other side. leaving the wailing sirens of Neo-Elysium behind them. They plunged into the dead world. The transition was absolute and jarring. The artificial, sterile luminescence of the domed city gave way to skies the color of bruised iron. Thick, acidic fog rolled across a landscape of fused glass, rusted metallic skeletons of ancient cities, and endless dunes of toxic, gray ash. The adrenaline of the escape slowly faded, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of the wasteland. Jax kept his eyes on the fractured, uneven terrain, utilizing complex sonar pings to avoid hidden sinkholes. He glanced over at Serafina, noting how perfectly still she sat. He offered a dark, sarcastic apology for the lack of in-flight entertainment and synthetic champagne on his luxury cruise. Serafina turned to him, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. A wry, unexpected smile played across her lips as she replied that she actually preferred the rugged ambiance of a suicidal escape. Jax let out a genuine, surprised laugh. The ice between them fractured. Over the next few hours of grueling travel, a quiet, unspoken respect began to take root. Jax observed the fierce, protective way Serafina watched over Leo, realizing she was entirely different from the parasitic, cold-blooded aristocrats he usually smuggled contraband for. Serafina watched Jax navigate the treacherous environment with a brilliant, pragmatic instinct her hyper-advanced tactical algorithms could not replicate. When the rover hit a massive trench and violently lurched, Jax threw his arm across her chest to stabilize her, their eyes locking for a long, charged moment. Beneath the layers of royal conditioning and cynical survivalism, an undeniable electric pull sparked between them. The quiet intimacy was shattered by a proximity alarm screaming from the rover's console. Jax slammed the brakes, the rover skidding wildly across the ash before sliding to a halt in the shadow of a collapsed highway overpass. From the thick, acidic fog, ragged silhouettes emerged. They were wasteland scavengers. These were outcasts who had survived the toxic environment by cobbling together terrifying, spiked suits of scrap metal and primitive filtration masks. They rode jury-rigged, combustion engine buggies that belched thick black smoke, completely surrounding Jax's stalled transport. There were at least 30 of them, armed with jagged thermal lances and heavy projectile rifles. They began to close the circle, their engines roaring aggressively, eager to strip the advanced rover down to its base components and slaughter its occupants for their hydration packs. Jax cursed, drawing his heavy blaster and unsealing his armored door. Serafina moved with lethal fluidity, stepping out of the passenger side, her pulse pistol humming with lethal intent. She calculated the odds. They were heavily outnumbered. Even with her advanced targeting telemetry and Jax's firepower, they would likely be overwhelmed by sheer numbers in the open terrain. Before either of them could fire a shot, Leo slipped out from the back seat of the rover. He walked directly past Jax's legs, stepping out into the open toxic ash. He did not look at the jagged spears or the terrifying masked faces of the scavengers. He looked down at the dead, irradiated soil beneath his small, bare feet. Then, Leo smiled. The reaction was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A deep, seismic tremor ripped through the earth, throwing several scavengers off their rusted buggies. The air pressure dropped violently. The localized frequency emanating from the child shattered the silence, a profound, resonant hum that vibrated in the teeth of everyone present. Directly in front of Leo, the ground violently ruptured. A massive, cylindrical spire of ancient, tarnished metal tore upward through the ash and fused glass, towering 50 feet into the bruised sky. It was a dormant purification node of the Genesis protocol. Heavy, luminous blue symbols ignited along the length of the metal spire. The air around them suddenly grew cold and crisp. With a deafening roar, a massive geyser of crystal-clear, purified water erupted from the apex of the structure, raining down over the wasteland like a torrential holy blessing, where the pure water touched the dead, irradiated soil. A violent biological reaction occurred. Thick, vibrant green grass shot upward from the ash, spreading outward in a rapid, undulating wave. Strange. Luminous flowers bloomed instantly, their petals unfolding to release a sweet, clean fragrance that aggressively pushed back the acidic fog. Within seconds, a massive circle of the wasteland had been transformed into a lush, thriving oasis of impossible, sudden life. The scavengers froze. The sheer impossibility of a living forest erupting in the dead zone shattered their aggression. Weapons dropped from their trembling hands, clattering uselessly against the newly formed grass. Several fell to their knees in the pure water, tearing off their filtration masks to drink frantically, weeping at the taste of something they had never experienced in their entire brutal lives. Jack slowly lowered his blaster, staring at the verdant miracle expanding around them. He looked at Serafina, who was staring at Leo with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. The boy had just breathed life into a corpse of a world. But Jax knew the terrifying reality of their situation. The massive spike of ancient geothermal energy required to activate the subterranean spire would not go unnoticed. Deep within the domed city of Neo-Elysium, the Chancellor's global monitoring grids had surely just registered a blinding beacon of unauthorized planetary activity, pointing a massive glowing arrow directly at their location, deep within the sterile, chrome-plated sanctum of the Chancellor's spire. A single crimson anomaly on a global holographic map sealed the fate of the runaway princess. The dead Earth had sung, and the architect of its murder had heard the terrifying melody. Valerius stood perfectly still as the telemetry data flooded his visual cortex. A Genesis node had activated in the toxic ash, a geographical impossibility unless the biological master key was present. His niece had not simply committed treason. She had stolen the instrument of their total destruction. He did not feel anger, for his emotional inhibitors were running at maximum capacity. But a cold, calculating urgency took hold. He turned away from the glowing globe and activated a secure channel. It was time to unleash the bloodhounds. These were not men, nor were they standard sanguine enforcers. The bloodhounds were nightmares forged in the deepest biovats of Neo-Elysium. They were heavily armored cyborgs, entirely stripped of visual and auditory organs to maximize their remaining predatory senses. Their smooth, eyeless helmets housed hypersensitive olfactory arrays and bioresonance trackers capable of isolating a single drop of royal synthetic blood or an unregistered human heartbeat from 100 miles away. They operated in absolute silence, a pack of apex predators wired together by a shared hive-mind consciousness. Within minutes, 6 sleek matte black pursuit interceptors dropped from the underside of the city's dome, piercing the smog layer and accelerating toward the wasteland at terrifying speeds. Back at the newly formed oasis, Jax did not waste a second marveling at the miracle of the green grass. He grabbed Serafina by her armored shoulder and shoved her toward the rover. The localized energy spike had undoubtedly painted a massive target on their backs. They threw Leo into the cabin, Jax slamming his hand onto the ignition sequence before the doors even sealed. The heavy rover tore away from the bewildered scavengers, its repulsor lifts whining in protest as Jax pushed the throttle past its safe operational limits. They left the temporary paradise behind, plunging back into the sprawling, jagged ruins of a 21st-century highway system. Colossal pillars of crumbling concrete held up twisting ribbons of fractured asphalt, creating a treacherous canyon of rusted rebar and ancient, forgotten vehicles. Jax navigated the labyrinth with white-knuckled intensity, drifting the massive rig around fallen overpasses while the acidic fog whipped past their reinforced windshield. Then, the proximity alarm screamed with a new, terrifying cadence. Serafina checked the rear tactical display, 6 blips moving at an impossible velocity were weaving through the concrete pillars behind them. The bloodhounds had caught their scent. The interceptors broke through the fog like thrown spears. They were low-profile hovercrafts, heavily armed and disturbingly agile. Without a single broadcasted warning, the lead interceptor opened fire. Concentrated beams of superheated plasma sliced through the gloom, searing the side of Jax's rover and melting a swath of the ancient asphalt just inches from their port side. Jax cursed vividly, throwing the steering yoke hard to the right. The rover violently slammed through the rusted guardrail of an elevated off-ramp, dropping 20 feet onto a lower section of the shattered highway. Serafina unsealed the reinforced sunroof, rising up into the howling wind with her heavy pulse pistol drawn. She took aim at the pursuing pack. Her advanced targeting algorithms locked onto the nearest interceptor, and she squeezed the trigger. A volley of high-yield energy bolts struck the bloodhound's craft, scoring the heavy armor but failing to penetrate its dense composite plating. These hunters were built to withstand a small war. The interceptors mirrored the rover's drop, sticking to their tail with mechanical perfection. Another plasma beam grazed the rover's rear thruster array, sending a shower of sparks into the cabin. They were losing speed. Jax yelled over the roaring wind, telling Serafina to brace herself and hold the boy tight. He reached beneath the main console and ripped off a hidden panel, exposing a row of unauthorized, flashing red switches. He slammed his fist down on the first two. From the rear dispensers of the rover, a cluster of cylindrical canisters tumbled out onto the fractured highway. They were illegal, military-grade electromagnetic pulse traps, highly volatile and wildly unpredictable. The canisters detonated precisely as the bloodhound pack flew over them. Blinding spheres of blue, crackling energy erupted across the roadway. The violent electromagnetic surge instantly fried the anti-gravity drives of 3 interceptors. The vehicles dropped like stones, smashing into the concrete at over 200 miles an hour in a catastrophic tangle of twisting metal and shattering armor. But the 3 remaining hunters violently banked, surfing the outer edge of the EMP blast wave. The lead bloodhound fired a kinetic harpoon. The heavy, depleted uranium projectile punched straight through the rover's rear armor plating, embedding itself deep within the main repulsor drive core. The rover's dashboard lit up with fatal warning signs. The rear lifts failed entirely, dropping the back half of the heavy vehicle onto the rough asphalt. A shower of blinding sparks engulfed the cabin as the metal chassis ground against the ancient road. Jax wrestled with the controls, using the remaining front thrusters to execute a controlled, violent spin. He aimed the dying rover toward a massive pile of collapsed concrete debris, using the terrain to break their momentum. The impact was brutal. The rover slammed into the rubble, deploying emergency foam restraints that pinned Jax, Serafina, and Leo to their seats. The reinforced glass shattered, and the world spun in a chaotic blur of gray ash and grinding metal before coming to a jarring, devastating halt. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of venting coolant and the distant fading whine of the remaining bloodhound interceptors circling back to assess the wreckage. Jax kicked his jammed door open, pulling himself from the crushed cabin. He reached back in, dragging Leo and a bruised Serafina out into the choking air. The rover was a total loss, its power core melting down into a puddle of glowing slag. Jax unholstered his blaster, scanning the sky. The final interceptors were hovering a mile away, scanning the debris field, likely transmitting their exact coordinates to a larger strike force. The smuggler knew they could not stay in the open. He grabbed 2 emergency hydration packs from the smoking ruin, and the trio fled into the dense, cavernous shadows of a collapsed subterranean transit station. They walked for hours, plunging deeper into the lightless tunnels, putting miles of concrete and twisted steel between themselves and the burning wreck of their only transport. The air grew colder, and the adrenaline finally bled out of their systems. leaving a heavy, profound exhaustion in its wake. They found a defensible alcove inside the rusted husk of an ancient, derailed subway car. Jax ignited a small, smokeless chemical flare, casting a dim, flickering orange light over the decaying interior. Leo, exhausted by the day's impossible events, curled up on a decaying passenger bench and immediately fell asleep, his breathing slow and steady. Serafina sat opposite Jax, her posture unusually slumped. The glowing violet lines beneath her skin seemed dim, almost fragile in the suffocating darkness of the old world. She looked at her hands, the synthetic skin flawless and pale, untouched by the grime that coated Jax's face and clothes. She broke the silence, her voice devoid of its usual royal command. She confessed that for a century, she had believed her people were the pinnacle of evolution, the saviors of a dying species. Now, sitting in the graveyard of human history, she realized they were nothing but beautiful parasites. They had stolen the sky and hoarded the Earth's natural life, trading their souls for a stagnant, synthetic eternity. She looked at Jax, her organic eyes reflecting the flare's light with a deep, haunting vulnerability. She asked him how he endured it, living a fleeting, fragile life in the shadow of immortals. Jax leaned back against the rusted metal, letting out a soft, tired breath. He told her that immortality was a coward's game. To live forever meant nothing had value, no choice had weight, and no love required sacrifice. He reached across the narrow space, his rough, grease-stained hand gently brushing against her synthetic fingers. He told her that humanity was not defined by how long a heart beats, but by what that heart is willing to break for. The cynical smuggler and the post-human princess sat in the quiet dark, their fingers intertwined, finding a strange, profound comfort in each other's touch. The divide between their worlds vanished, replaced by a quiet, fierce bond forged in the fires of survival. But the peace was a fragile illusion. Serafina knew her uncle's relentless nature. If the bloodhounds had failed to bring back the child, Valerius would escalate the hunt to a level of terrifying destruction they could not possibly comprehend. Somewhere out in the deep wasteland, a hidden refuge called Sanctuary waited for them, holding the answers to the planet's salvation. Yet, as Jax stared into the oppressive dark of the tunnel, he could not shake the gnawing certainty that their arrival might bring a storm that would wipe that final haven from the face of the earth. The rusted iron doors of the mountain did not open with a mechanical groan, but with the soft, impossible sigh of living vines parting for their true master. Sanctuary was not merely a bunker. It was a beating green heart buried alive in a tomb of ash. For 2 grueling days, Jax had navigated the subterranean labyrinth using archaic geological maps, guiding them deeper into the earth until the oppressive concrete gave way to natural limestone. As they stepped through the massive, vine-choked threshold, the suffocating scent of the wasteland was instantly replaced by the intoxicating aroma of damp soil, blooming jasmine, and fresh, oxygen-rich air. Serafina stood paralyzed at the entrance. Before her lay a colossal underground cavern, illuminated by towering shafts of captured, filtered sunlight channeled from the surface through ancient fiber-optic pillars. This was the Global Seed Vault, a legendary pre-collapse installation meant to safeguard the planet's botanical diversity. It had blossomed into a thriving, subterranean jungle. Massive terraced farms cascaded down the cavern walls, overflowing with vibrant crops. Crystal-clear waterfalls spilled from aquifer vents, feeding a central lake where naturals, unaugmented, healthy, and smiling, hauled in nets of silver fish. Children ran freely through the winding dirt paths, their laughter echoing without the harsh dampening of acoustic compliance fields. There were no enforcers, no glowing lifelines, and no fear. It was a chaotic, beautiful explosion of genuine life, standing in stark defiance of the sterile, bloodless metropolis Seraphina had ruled. A contingent of sanctuary guards approached, their weapons lowered but ready. They were clad in reinforced leather and woven plant fibers, a sharp contrast to the polished chrome of the sanguine aristocracy. Leading them was an elderly man leaning on a carved wooden staff. Seraphina had never seen a human age naturally. The man's face was a map of deep creases, his hair the color of spun silver, yet his eyes held a sharp, unyielding vitality that commanded absolute respect. He introduced himself as Elder Aris. His gaze shifted from the imposing cloaked figure of the princess to the rugged smuggler, and finally, it settled on little Leo. The elder's breath caught in his throat. He dropped to his knees in the rich soil, bowing his head not in submission, but in profound, overwhelming reverence. The boy with the ancient sequence had finally returned to the source. Aris led them through the bustling settlement to a command center built into the hollowed-out trunk of a petrified redwood. Screens of cracked glass and salvaged circuitry hummed alongside creeping ivy. Here, away from the prying eyes of the settlement, Aris revealed the agonizing truth that lay dormant in the Earth's crust. He activated a central holographic projector. A spinning three-dimensional model of the planet materialized. Overlaid with a complex web of glowing green nodes, Aris explained that Leo was the verdant key, a genetically locked clone of the original Genesis architect, perfectly preserved in stasis until a faction of rebel naturals managed to smuggle his incubator into the lower slums of Neo-Elysium. The activation in the wasteland was merely a localized tremor to heal the world. Leo needed to reach the global interface core, located directly beneath the Chancellor's central spire in the heart of the sanguine city. Seraphina absorbed the tactical data with her augmented mind, mapping out a dozen impossible infiltration routes. She stated confidently that they could breach the city, deploy the boy, and shatter the dome, ending her uncle's reign of terror. Aris looked at her with a profound, crushing sorrow. He deactivated the hologram. He explained that the Genesis protocol was not merely a mechanical process, it was a violent biological purge. When the global network activated, the subterranean spires would release a massive atmospheric wave of a highly aggressive, terraforming enzyme. This enzyme was designed to instantaneously break down heavy synthetic carbons and airborne toxins, returning the atmosphere to a baseline, pre-industrial purity. The silence in the redwood chamber grew suffocating. Seraphina's hyper-advanced cognitive processors connected the data points a fraction of a second before Aris spoke the words. Synthoxy. The artificial blood that granted the sanguine aristocracy their immortality was entirely composed of heavily oxygenated synthetic carbons. It was, molecularly speaking, a hyper-concentrated toxin. If Leo smiled at the planetary core interface, the Earth would heal, and the skies would clear. But the very air they breathed would become a lethal solvent to the post-human race. The enzyme would instantly coagulate the synthoxy in their veins, turning their artificial blood into concrete. Every single sanguine aristocrat, including the innocent civilians who knew nothing of Valerius's dark reign, would suffocate within minutes. Seraphina touched the glowing violet conduits on her neck, feeling the smooth, rhythmic pulse of the fluid that kept her alive. Saving humanity and resurrecting the planet demanded the complete, unavoidable extinction of her own kind. It demanded her own life. She turned away from the console, walking out onto a wooden balcony that overlooked the sprawling, verdant farms below. She was a ruler bred for cold, algorithmic logic, taught that sacrifice was something demanded of the weak, not offered by the strong. Yet, as she watched a natural mother playfully chase her daughter through a field of golden wheat, the logic dissolved into a profound, terrifying moral clarity. Her people were a disease the Earth had been waiting a century to cure. Jack stepped onto the balcony, the worn leather of his jacket creaking softly. He stood beside her, leaning his forearms on the wooden railing. He did not offer platitudes or sugarcoat the brutal reality of the physics. He simply looked at the woman who had traded her crown for a scavenger's cloak. He broke the heavy silence with his trademark dark humor, noting that he always knew her family's politics were incredibly toxic, but he never imagined it was a literal, molecular fact. Serafina offered a weak, fractured laugh, the sound catching painfully in her throat. She confessed to him that she was terrified. For a century, she had lived with the absolute certainty of tomorrow. Now, staring at the beautiful, messy reality of the naturals, she realized she had never actually lived at all. She was a beautifully engineered ghost, and now she was being asked to dig her own grave to let the living inherit the earth. Jax reached out, gently turning her to face him. He traced the glowing violet line along her jaw with a grease-stained thumb, his rough skin a stark contrast to her flawless synthetic plating. He told her with fierce, unshakable conviction that he would rather spend one single, genuine day standing beside her in the sunlight than live 1,000 years hiding in the shadows of a synthetic dome. He promised that if she chose to make the ultimate sacrifice, she would not walk into the dark alone. He kissed her, and for the first time in her long, engineered existence, Serafina felt her organic heart completely overpower her synthetic mind. It was a kiss of desperate, undeniable truth, a fragile rebellion against the cold machinery of their world. Yet, beneath the warmth of the sanctuary and the newfound strength in their bond, a deadly current was already moving in the shadows. Far below the balcony, in the damp, shadowy corners of the hydroponic filtration bays, a man with bitter, hateful eyes watched the princess and the smuggler. He was a survivor of a sanguine tithe raid, his body scarred by the shock bolus of Serafina's enforcers. He did not care about profound moral shifts or the redemption of a royal soul. He only saw the enemy standing in his home. With trembling fingers, the disgruntled survivor pulled a scavenged, high-frequency sanguine communication relay from his satchel. He had found it years ago in the wasteland, dead and useless, until the arrival of the princess's royal tech passively charged its microcell. He keyed in an emergency distress frequency. His eyes locked on the glowing violet veins of the woman on the balcony above. A tiny, solitary red light blinked to life on the device. A silent, encrypted coordinate burst shot upward, piercing the limestone rock and rocketing through the atmosphere, straight toward the shimmering dome of Neo-Elysium. Back in the command center, Elder Eris watched the holographic globe slowly rotate on its axis. He pulled up a deeply buried, highly theoretical medical file he had discovered in the ancient archives. It detailed an agonizing, highly fatal biological purge, a complete blood replacement therapy that could theoretically strip the synthetic carbons from a post-human body and shock their dormant bone marrow into producing natural blood. It was a complete gamble, requiring advanced sanguine centrifuges and a pure genetic donor. He stared at the glowing data, wondering if he dared offer the princess a microscopic sliver of hope, unaware that the time for medical miracles was already running out. The sanctuary of the old world was about to burn, ignited by a single desperate spark of human bitterness. A plea for mercy was about to bring the mechanical gods of death straight to their hidden doorstep. Kale, the scarred survivor hiding in the damp shadows of the hydroponic bays, stared at the blinking red light on his scavenged communicator. A digitized voice from the world above had promised him and his family a place in the upper tiers of Neo-Elysium, a life entirely free from the suffocating ash and the constant fear of discovery, in exchange for the exact coordinates of the traitor princess. He believed the beautifully constructed lie with the tragic, blinding desperation of a man who had known nothing but dark tunnels and suffering. He did not realize that the sanguine aristocracy never negotiated with what they considered obsolete biological matter. High above the toxic cloud layer, Chancellor Valerius received the encrypted ping. He did not order a surgical extraction team to secure the area. He ordered a Class 4 orbital bombardment. Inside the hollowed-out Redwood Command Center, Elder Aris was frantically compiling the theoretical blood replacement data onto a portable crystalline drive, hoping to offer Serafina a microscopic sliver of a future, out on the wooden balcony overlooking the vibrant farms. Jax and Serafina had barely pulled away from their quiet embrace when the first massive seismic shock hit the cavern. It was not an earthquake. It was the apocalyptic wrath of the sky falling. The colossal limestone ceiling of the underground sanctuary fractured with a deafening, concussive roar. Massive, jagged chunks of rock, some the size of transport shuttles, plummeted into the central lake below, sending tidal waves of displaced water crashing violently through the terraced wheat fields. Shafts of blinding, harsh, artificial light pierced the gentle gloom as sanguine drop pods, shaped like massive iron spikes, slammed into the soft, rich earth of the oasis. The heavy transport pods hissed open, venting clouds of supercooled atmospheric gas, and out stepped the elite sanguine shock troops. They were terrifying giants of polished obsidian armor, wielding heavy thermal cannons that immediately began incinerating the ancient, carefully cultivated flora. They did not shout orders to surrender. They simply began a systematic, mathematical slaughter of the panicked naturals fleeing through the burning crops. Serafina's combat telemetry violently rebooted, instantly flooding her visual cortex with hundreds of hostile red targeting vectors. She tore off her heavy, coarse scavenger's cloak, revealing the glowing violet conduits pulsing rapidly beneath her flawless synthetic skin. She drew her humming pulse pistol, vaulted over the shattered wooden railing, and dropped 40 feet into the chaotic fray below with devastating, post-human grace. Jax was a heartbeat behind her. He grabbed a heavy repeater rifle from a fallen sanctuary guard, sliding rapidly down a tangled mass of burning vines to join the princess. He laid down a suppressing barrage of heavy plasma fire, covering her flank as she moved through the heavily armored shock troops like a crimson blur. Serafina utilized her hyper-advanced processing speed to perfectly anticipate the enemy's combat trajectories. She slipped beneath the brutal sweeping arc of a heavy shock blade, firing 2 precise superheated energy bolts directly into the microscopic joints of a trooper's knee plating. The giant crashed to the soil, and she executed a point-blank finishing shot without breaking her stride. Jax covered her blind spots, using his rugged, pragmatic combat experience to drop illegal thermal grenades into the exposed rear exhaust ports of the enemy armor, detonating them from the inside out. Jax yelled over the deafening roar of burning agriculture, asking if her family always overreacted so violently to unannounced visits. Serafina fired a concentrated beam that melted a sanguine helmet into a pool of glowing slag, shouting back that her uncle was notoriously particular about his schedule. They fought back to back, a seamless, deadly fusion of perfect post-human lethality and gritty, unpredictable human survivalism. But for every armored soldier they brought down, 2 more emerged from the falling drop pods. The beautiful, vibrant sanctuary was rapidly transforming into a suffocating charnel house of burning wheat and shattered glass. Amidst the absolute chaos, little Leo stood frozen near the edge of the boiling lake, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears. He was completely terrified, his world-altering biological frequency locked away by pure, paralyzing fear. Then, the ambient temperature in the cavern plummeted to a freezing chill. A command drop pod twice the size of the others tore through the shattered ceiling, landing with a catastrophic impact that threw Jax and Serafina entirely off their feet. The pod unfurled like a mechanical flower of death, and Chancellor Valerius stepped onto the burning, ruined soil. He was a terrifying monument of lethal engineering, his synthetic bloodlines pulsing with an aggressive, blinding crimson light that cut through the thick smoke. He did not look at the dying naturals or the burning crops. His mechanical, sensor-laden eyes locked instantly and exclusively on the small boy. Jax saw the Chancellor's trajectory and scrambled frantically to his feet, throwing himself directly between the posthuman warlord and Leo. The smuggler raised his heavy repeater rifle, unleashing a continuous, desperate stream of plasma fire directly at Valerius's chest plate. Valerius did not even slow his relentless stride. He raised a single hand, deploying a localized, kinetic deflector shield that absorbed the searing plasma bolts as if they were nothing more than harmless raindrops, in a single fluid motion that defied the basic laws of physics. Valerius crossed the remaining distance and struck Jax. It was a calculated, devastating blow. The Chancellor's reinforced carbon fiber fist slammed into Jax's chest with the force of a speeding transport. The impact shattered the smuggler's ribs instantly, sending him flying backward through the air. Jax crashed brutally against the dense trunk of a burning redwood, his body crumpling to the ground, a sickening wet crack echoing clearly over the roar of the massive flames. Seraphina screamed Jax's name, her organic heart twisting in an agonizing spasm of pure terror. She leveled her weapon at Valerius, her targeting reticle turning solid red. But before she could pull the trigger, the Chancellor casually reached down and lifted Leo by the collar of his oversized tunic. The boy dangled helplessly in the air, his small face pale and frozen with horror. Valerius looked at Seraphina with cold, synthetic disdain. He projected his heavily amplified voice across the burning cavern, declaring her an obsolete, emotional failure. He revealed to her that he had absolutely no intention of letting the Genesis code rot uselessly in the earth. Once Leo's genetic sequence was violently extracted, his chief engineers would reverse engineer the biological trigger. Valerius planned to weaponize the terraforming network, using the purification spires to permanently sterilize the lower sectors and expand the sanguine dome across the entire dead planet. He was going to turn the very instrument of planetary salvation into the ultimate engine of eternal tyranny. Valerius turned his back on his niece, deeming her completely broken, unarmed by her own grief, and utterly irrelevant to his grand design. He engaged the heavy repulsor thrusters built into his armored boots, launching himself and the captive boy back into his command pod. The massive thrusters ignited, incinerating the remaining sanctuary defenders in a cone of blinding blue fire as the pod rocketed upward, disappearing back through the shattered ceiling into the toxic, iron-colored sky. The remaining shock troops systematically retreated to their own vessels, leaving the surviving naturals to burn and weep in the ruins of their shattered paradise. The massive cavern grew eerily quiet, save for the violent crackling of the massive fires and the distant, haunting wails of the broken survivors. Seraphina dropped her weapon and sprinted to the base of the burning redwood. Jax lay entirely motionless, his breathing incredibly shallow and ragged, dark crimson blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. His lungs were failing rapidly, his human frailty fully exposed and broken against the terrifying, unyielding power of the sanguine elite. She fell heavily to her knees, her flawless synthetic hands trembling violently as she pressed them against his shattered chest, trying desperately to stem the internal bleeding. Valerius had stolen the key to the planet's salvation and left the only man she had ever truly loved bleeding out in a pile of ashes. How could a fallen, disgraced princess and a dying smuggler possibly breach the impenetrable, heavily guarded fortress of Neo-Elysium? And could the ancient, unproven medical secrets clutched in Elder Eris's trembling hands actually save Jax before his organic human heart beat its last? The blood pooling beneath Jax was a stark, fragile crimson, a devastating contrast to the synthetic violet life pulsing in Seraphina's veins. To save a dying human, a post-human princess had to dismantle her own immortality piece by agonizing piece. She ripped the heavy armored gauntlets from her hands, ignoring the chaos of the burning sanctuary around them. Elder Aris knelt beside her, his weathered hands trembling as he offered the crystalline data drive containing the theoretical blood replacement research. But Seraphina knew they did not have hours for a surgical procedure. Jax was drowning in his own shattered chest. She deployed the emergency medical port on her wrist, extending a microscopic luminescent surgical tether. Without a single moment of hesitation, she plunged the tether directly into Jax's ruined chest cavity. Bypassing his collapsed lung and interfacing directly with his failing cardiovascular system, Seraphina commanded her internal hyper-advanced nanites to abandon their maintenance of her cybernetic enhancements and flood into the smuggler's organic body. It was a terrifying, unauthorized biological transfer. The glowing violet fluid in her neck instantly dimmed to a pale, sickly lavender. A wave of profound, paralyzing exhaustion slammed into her mechanical joints as her body surrendered its vital synthetic strength to rapidly knit human bone and cauterize torn arteries. Jax gasped violently, his eyes flying open as the post-human nanites forced his lungs to inflate. He coughed a spray of dark blood onto his chin, looking up at the pale, trembling princess leaning over him. He offered a weak, agonizing smirk, muttering that he always knew she had a soft spot for rough, unrefined locals. Seraphina pressed her forehead against his, a single organic tear mixing with the soot on her cheek. The bond between them solidified in the ash of the ruined oasis. They were bound by a fierce, defiant love and a staggering, monumental duty. They had to return to the heart of the machine that was murdering the world, using the last reserves of her physical strength. Seraphina hauled Jax to his feet. They commandeered one of the heavy sanguine drop pods abandoned in the chaotic retreat of the shock troops. The interior was cramped, smelling of ozone and spent thermal energy. Jax slumped into the co-pilot seat, his breathing shallow but steady thanks to the swarm of royal nanites holding his chest together. He pulled his heavy datapad from his jacket, his fingers flying across the cracked screen despite the searing pain in his ribs. They were initiating a suicidal infiltration of the most heavily fortified structure on the planet. The heavy pod launched upward through the shattered cavern ceiling, rocketing back into the bruised iron-colored sky. Above them, the colossal shimmering energy dome of Neo-Elysium loomed like an impenetrable glass cage. Seraphina seized the primary controls, accelerating the stolen pod directly toward the lethal plasma barrier. Jax spliced his datapad into the pod's communication array, intercepting the city's automated defense grid interrogations, as the massive anti-aircraft turrets on the dome tracked their approach. Seraphina transmitted a highly classified, archaic royal bloodline code, a backdoor protocol programmed by her ancestors centuries ago and long forgotten by the modern algorithmic security networks. The plasma barrier rippled, parting just enough to let the heavy pod slip through before snapping shut behind them. They bypassed the gleaming, sterile upper spires, diving the pod into the dark, labyrinthine maintenance shafts of the city's underbelly. Jax bypassed 3 internal security checkpoints by rapidly rerouting the central processing logic, his cynical brilliance turning the Chancellor's perfect security apparatus against itself. He wiped sweat from his brow, remarking casually that for a man trying to play God, Valerius had left incredibly sloppy firewalls in his basement. They abandoned the pod at the base of the central spire, the towering structural heart of the sanguine aristocracy, armed with Jax's remaining thermal grenades and Seraphina's pulsing energy weapon. They breached the primary maintenance hatch of the High Council's private maglev elevator, as the glass-walled carriage shot upward at a terrifying velocity. The sprawling, bloodless metropolis of Neo-Elysium spread out beneath them. The sterile, sun-simulated streets were entirely devoid of genuine life, a monument to beautifully engineered stagnation. Seraphina stepped to the elevator's internal control console. She was no longer running. She was pulling the curtain down on a century of lies. She sliced her encrypted royal override into the city's central broadcast node. Instantly, every holographic billboard, every ambient audio emitter, and every personal retinal display in Neo-Elysium hijacked to a single unyielding feed. Serafina's face, pale, bruised, and stripped of her royal armor, projected across the entire sky of the domed city. Her voice echoed with absolute, devastating clarity. She addressed the citizens of Neo-Elysium not as their future queen, but as their judge. She exposed the eradication mandate, detailing Valerius's imminent plan to mass incinerate the naturals living in the subterranean slums. She displayed the stolen telemetry data of the active Genesis node, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Earth was not dead, merely suffocated by the very people claiming to be its saviors. She spoke of the terrible, toxic nature of their immortality, explaining that their artificial synth-oxy was a poison that prevented the planet from breathing. She demanded they look at their flawless synthetic hands and realize they were holding the murder weapon of a world. She urged them to reject the Chancellor's absolute control, to embrace the messy, beautiful reality of natural mortality, and to let the Earth heal. The broadcast sent a violent shockwave through the city. Automated enforcers halted their patrols, their command structures confused by the royal override, while millions of post-human citizens stared up at the sky in sheer, terrified disbelief. Would the sanguine aristocracy heed the desperate plea of a fallen princess? Or would they violently defend their parasitic eternity and allow the ancient world to burn to ash? The elevator violently decelerated, the massive inertial dampeners whining loudly as it reached the apex of the central spire. The reinforced plasteel doors blew open in a shower of sparks, courtesy of Jax's heavy repeater rifle. They stepped into the Chancellor's central laboratory. It was a cavernous, terrifying temple of cold chrome and blinding white light. At the center of the room sat a massive, imposing surgical centrifuge, an angular machine designed to strip a biological organism down to its raw genetic base code. Strapped horizontally to the cold metal table was Leo. The small boy was entirely immobilized by heavy magnetic restraints, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing horror. Standing over the control terminal was Chancellor Valerius. He had shed his heavy combat armor, revealing the horrifying extent of his augmentations. He was a lattice of dark, polished carbon fiber, his exposed synthetic blood conduits glowing with a blinding, aggressive crimson intensity. He looked up as the elevator doors shattered, his expression completely devoid of surprise. Valerius calmly engaged the primary extraction protocol. The massive centrifuge powered up with a deafening, bone-rattling hum. A terrifying array of long, glowing crystalline needles descended rapidly from the ceiling directly toward the terrified child's chest. Could Serafina and a half-broken smuggler possibly cross the laboratory and defeat a fully augmented post-human warlord before the colossal machinery tore the planet's final hope from the boy's DNA? The blindingly white laboratory of the sanguine aristocracy was about to become a slaughterhouse. A half-broken smuggler and a compromised princess stood before a post-human god, with the absolute fate of the Earth strapped to a cold metal table. Jax did not hesitate to shatter the sterile silence. He leveled his heavy repeater rifle and unleashed a blinding torrent of superheated plasma directly at the Chancellor's chest. Valerius moved with a velocity that mocked the fundamental laws of physics. He did not simply dodge the barrage. He phased through the lethal crossfire, his carbon fiber limbs blurring into a terrifying dark wave. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, his armored hand lashing out to crush the barrel of Jax's rifle into useless, molten slag. With a casual, devastating backhand, Valerius sent the smuggler skidding violently across the polished marble floor, his newly patched ribs screaming in agonizing protest. Serafina vaulted over a glowing diagnostic console, firing her pulse pistol in rapid, calculated bursts. Valerius deflected the energy bolts with his kinetic shielding, stepping into her guard with brutal, algorithmic precision. Serafina fought back with a century of elite royal conditioning, driving a hyper-accelerated strike toward his exposed power core. But her physical reserves were fatally depleted. The swarm of nanites she had gifted to Jax left her cybernetic joints sluggish and violently uncalibrated. Valerius caught her wrist, the force of his grip grinding her reinforced plasteel bones together. He lifted her effortlessly off the floor, his mechanical eyes utterly devoid of mercy. Valerius declared her a tragic malfunction, a glorious machine corrupted by a primitive, biological flaw called empathy. He tightened his grip around her throat, rapidly cutting off her oxygen intake while the massive centrifuge behind him hummed with lethal intent. The array of glowing crystalline needles descended rapidly, inches away from piercing Leo's small, fragile chest to violently tear the Genesis code from his DNA. Will Jax find the strength to save them, or will the Earth's final hope die on a sterile table? Jax, bleeding heavily onto the pristine white floor, dragged himself onto his knees. He knew his blaster fire could not pierce the Chancellor's armor, and his own body was rapidly shutting down. He looked at the descending needles, then at the heavy thermal grenade still clipped to his belt. He did not aim for the invulnerable warlord. He aimed for the machine. Jax primed the explosive and hurled it with a desperate, roaring cry, straight into the exposed primary power conduit feeding the centrifuge. The explosion was a contained, concussive roar of blinding orange fire. The blast wave shattered the sterile laboratory, sending diagnostic monitors crashing to the ground and temporarily blinding Valerius's optical sensors. The kinetic shock severed the magnetic locks holding the child. The heavy metal restraints snapped open, freeing the boy just as the crystalline needles plunged downward, shattering uselessly against the empty plasteel table. Valerius dropped Serafina, whirling around with a roar of pure synthetic fury. The boy was supposed to be a helpless biological vessel, easily secured and harvested. Instead, Leo stood atop the ruined centrifuge, the thick smoke from the explosion swirling around his oversized tunic. The Chancellor raised a hand, his built-in thermal cannon charging with a lethal, blinding glow, ready to simply incinerate the child and scrape the genetic ash from the floor. He demanded the boy surrender to the inevitable perfection of the machine. Leo did not run. He did not cower. He looked at the monstrous, chrome-plated dictator, a creature who had completely erased his own soul to conquer death. Then, he looked down at Serafina, who was gasping for air on the shattered floor, her glowing violet lines dim and flickering, having sacrificed her own godhood to save a cynical human smuggler. Leo understood the profound, terrible beauty of that choice. He looked back at Valerius, and he offered a final, radiant smile. It was not a localized tremor this time. It was a planetary detonation of pure, biological resonance. The smile unleashed a massive, cascading frequency wave that hit the laboratory like a physical tidal wave. The deafening hum of the sanguine technology was instantly swallowed by a deep, seismic roar echoing from the very core of the Earth. The ancient Genesis network awoke. Across the globe, thousands of dormant subterranean spires erupted from the toxic ash and fused glass. Towering into the bruised sky, they collectively released a colossal, invisible atmospheric shockwave of the terraforming enzyme. The wave slammed into the shimmering plasma dome of Neo-Elysium, instantly neutralizing the force field and shattering the barrier that had separated the sanguine aristocracy from the natural world for a century. The purified air flooded into the central laboratory. Valerius froze, his hand still raised. The aggressive terraforming enzyme flooded his respiratory intakes, aggressively attacking the synthetic carbons of his synth oxy. The blinding crimson light of his subdermal conduits violently flashed, then abruptly turned a sickening solid black. His artificial blood coagulated instantly, transforming into a dense, unyielding sludge. The dictator let out a fractured mechanical wheeze as his life support systems catastrophically overloaded. His internal carbon fiber muscles locked into stone. Chancellor Valerius, the immortal architect of a dead world, fell backward, striking the marble floor as a lifeless, heavy statue of obsolete chrome. The wave washed over Serafina, her remaining synthetic systems violently short-circuited. The pale lavender fluid in her neck thickened, her cybernetic limbs going entirely numb. She collapsed against the ruined console, her vision fading to black, waiting for the cold, absolute silence of death. She had made her choice, and she was ready to pay the price for the Earth's salvation. But the silence never came. Instead, a searing, agonizing heat erupted deep within the marrow of her remaining organic bones. The ancient frequency did not merely purge the synthetic. It commanded the biological to fiercely adapt and survive. As the last of her synth-oxy hardened and died, her organic heart gave a violent, rebellious lurch. It pumped a single desperate drop of newly forged, bright red human blood through her veins. Pushing past the dead synthetic blockages, she gasped, her lungs expanding to take in the crisp, incredibly sweet scent of the purified air. Her body was rejecting its engineered immortality and painfully, beautifully birthing her into a fragile, mortal human. Jax limped over to her, his own breath catching as he watched the glowing lines on her neck permanently fade, replaced by the soft, warm flush of genuine human life. He reached out, his rough hand pulling her up from the debris. He smiled, a genuine tear-streaked grin, and whispered that she looked absolutely terrible, but entirely perfect. Together, leaning heavily on each other, they walked toward the shattered glass wall of the laboratory, with little Leo walking quietly beside them. The world outside was unrecognizable. The suffocating smog layer was completely gone, dissolved by the aggressive atmospheric purge. For the first time in countless generations, the citizens of Neo-Elysium and the naturals emerging from the subterranean slums looked up and saw the sky. It was a brilliant, unblemished azure, stretching endlessly over a world rapidly bursting with impossible green life. The natural sun broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the sterile spires, melting the cold shadows of the aristocracy forever. The sanguine survivors who had not fully replaced their organic systems were violently sick, purging the synthetic toxins from their bodies as they were forced back into mortality. But they were alive. The age of perfect, stagnant machines was over. The era of fragile, beautiful, and profoundly messy humanity had returned. Serafina, Jax, and Leo stood at the apex of the healing world, watching the sunrise not as conquerors or immortals, but as the first true mortals of a brand new Earth, ready to embrace the fleeting, incredible gift of a natural life. Thank you so much for watching this journey unfold. If you enjoyed this dive into a ruined world and the impossible power of a single smile, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who loves a gritty, hopeful sci-fi adventure. I want to hear from you in the comments. So drop the word "breathe" down below so I know you made it all the way to the end. And do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can break through the algorithm and reach more viewers exactly like you.